Welcome to our continuing series on environmental leadership, energy leadership, and celebration of the 40 years of this department. It's a great pleasure to have a very distinguished speaker here today, and I want to welcome all those from not just the department here in Hartford, but we're broadcasting this to other parts of our agency across the state. And thanks as well to the public who have come in large numbers. So I see a number of Audubon folks who are here. I see a couple of our state reps. Representative Shibrun, thank you for coming. Phil Miller, thank you for coming. We really are trying with this series to have a dialogue, have a conversation about some of the critical issues we're facing, the choices that have to be made, how to make them. And we're also celebrating the work of this agency over 40 years, celebrating what all of you who work for DEEP do every day. And today it's a special pleasure to lift up the environmental conservation side of the house. We have lots that we do on pollution control that gets attention. The energy issues have been burning bright in recent days, but I am especially pleased that today we are celebrating and honoring the work of wildlife protection, of our conservation agenda, of land use, and of how we provide recreational opportunities, hunting, fishing, boating, outdoor recreation in a variety of forms for Connecticut citizens, and frankly for hundreds of thousands of visitors who come to the state every summer and across the year as well. So today we have one of America's true environmental superstars. David Yarnold is head of the National Audubon Society and has been head now for a couple of years. And prior to that, had a career with the Environmental Defense Fund. So he too has swept across the range of issues that might be thought of as part of the environmental agenda. He has brought a very strong new leadership to the Audubon Society and has helped them to develop a shared set of conservation goals that are really unifying the efforts across all the separate Audubon societies that exist in the different states. So I think he is building both national leadership, but also grassroots outreach. And it's a special joy to see that agenda emerging. So without further ado, let me introduce David Yarnold, who we are thrilled to have with us today. David, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. Thank you, Commissioner Esty. I want to offer a special thank you to the Audubon Connecticut Board, Marty Cannon, Chair of the Board, and the rest of you. Thanks for making the time to come today. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Audubon Connecticut, and then Patrick Comins, who's Director of Bird Conservation for Connecticut, is going to come up and tell you a little bit about Connecticut-specific activities. If I were to tell you I had an idea for a conservation network, and this network would have 470 chapters across America in every state, and that it would have 500,000 paid members, and that it would touch 4 million people through its communications channels, through its magazine, through its web, the web portals. And if I would tell you that we would have 50 education centers that touch 1 million people a year, you'd say, that's pretty expensive to build, isn't it? And I'd say, no, actually, that's Audubon. That's our installed base. That's who we are. That's what we've built for 107 years. And this organization and this brand is in the midst of a reinvigoration, a reinvention, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. If you were to be joining this organization, one of the things you would want to say, or if you wanted to fund it, one of the things you'd want to know is, so conservation takes a long time. It's a hard thing to do. We all know that it takes a long time to get results, but you'd probably ask, so how was your last year? What'd you do last year? And I would tell you about 3 different conservation victories. I would tell you about 11 million pristine acres in Alaska that have finally been set aside in the National Petroleum Reserve. That plan was 20 years in the making, and half of it has now been set aside for preservation. I would tell you about the fact that 80% of BP's civil penalties are going to go to restoring the 5 Gulf Coast states that were most hammered by BP's spill, particularly the wetlands of Louisiana, and that's at a scale up to $20 billion. That's at a scale that can actually begin to restore America's delta. That is significant change. And I would tell you about the fact that for the first time, there are guidelines about where to put wind power in America so that we can get on with rolling out renewables, dealing with climate change, and doing it in a way that minimizes the impact to birds and other wildlife. And I would tell you that aside from the Department of the Interior, there's only one common denominator in all 3 of those victories from last year, and it was the National Audubon Society. When I took this job 2.5 years ago, I was sitting with a friend of mine, and I told him about what we did, and he said, "I thought you promoted bird watching." And I said, "Of course, we come to conservation through birds. We have this amazing wingspan. We have this extraordinary wingspan. Every weekend across this country, there are people out pulling invasive species, restoring river flows, restoring wetlands. They're out there across this country protecting beach habitat. And in the wake of Sandy's destruction here and in the other coastal northeastern states, it's never been more important to field the army of volunteers that Audubon turns out week in and week out on every coast in America, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic to the Pacific. This program, Protecting Beaches Through Beach Stewards, is alive and thriving through our chapters everywhere. We know that in order to grow Audubon's base, to reach a new generation of members, we're going to need new tools, we're going to need new communications channels. This online scavenger hunt ran last year. More than 10,000 people played it addictively. The winner was a couch potato from Massachusetts, a marketing executive who's now a real-life birder. I met 2 sisters, foster kids from Louisiana, rural Louisiana, who fell in love with this game and emailed us and said, in the nicest possible way, I have a young daughter, so I was just so touched by this. They said, "We're playing the game, and would it be possible to send us a couple of clues? We'd understood if you couldn't." And so I wrote back and I said, "I'd like to know more about you. Actually, I would like you to tell your mother that you wrote to me, and I would like to talk to her." So we met them, and they turned out to be these passionate young birders. And so we know that by working online, we're going to be able to grow our membership from 500,000 paid members to 1 million members within a few years. So we are the voice of birds, and we work in communities from Pensacola to Fresno to Buffalo. We work in purple states, we work in blue states, we work in red states because we understand regional ways of life. Audubon comes from the grassroots, so the people who advocate for beach stewardship or for the preservation of longleaf pine forests, these are the folks who sit alongside the decision makers in their pews and their kids go to classrooms together. We're not an organization based inside the Beltway that parachutes in. We come from the grassroots. We have an authentic voice, and that's why we're effective. But like everybody else, we understand that conservation has become a political football, and I'm really tired of it. We understand that the environment it has become an issue that is identified with one party and not the other. Well, we also know that in parts of the country, specifically the American West, up to 70% of people say there's no inherent contradiction between producing more energy and preserving wildlife. that conservation ethos and the ability to mine new energy sources go hand in glove if it's approached correctly. So a lot of organizations have talked about this, and not a lot of green groups can work in red and purple and blue states. Audubon can. So people have talked about it. Audubon actually did something about it. Last fall, we launched a campaign during the election that said conservation doesn't have a party. And what I'd say behind closed doors is, I would add, damn it. And we asked people to sign the American Eagle Compact. 120,000 people signed on to 5 principles. 55,000 of them are now Audubon members, mostly in red western states, where they can greet legislators who are used to being accosted primarily by passionate, rabid, fill-in-the-blank advocates. And instead, they're going to be able to go out and say, actually, I'm one of you. I live here in this red state. I am from your community, and I believe in conservation. So we went out and enlisted a whole new division for Audubon's Army. And we do all of this. These are our 5 priorities. We'll have copies of our strategic plan. It's on the web. We're happy to talk about it more, but I'm not going to read this or go into it in great depth. We have found that by using particular species, what we are calling focal species, that we can leverage their scarcity and the threats to them so that we can protect large-scale landscapes. Because the scale of the threats that we face across this country and hemispherically are so big that we have to align by flyways. So Francis Grant Sooty, our VP for the Atlantic Flyway, is here with us today. I'd urge you to talk with him. We've aligned by the 4 major flyways, the superhighways in the sky that birds lead us to, because we know that the only way to do effective conservation is to work at that scale. Because half of the birds in North America are smart enough to go south for the winter. We have to be able to protect them, whether they're down in Chiloé Island or whether they're down in Belize. But most of all, we have to be able to protect them whether they're down in Florida or South Carolina or here in the northern forests of Connecticut. That story, by the way, that bird helped protect 15 million acres in the West. Audubon has always been based on sound science. This is the science that we use to talk about our no regrets climate mapping. We've basically looked at the worst case, or at least what we thought was the worst case climate scenarios. We've overlaid hundreds of layers of data using GIS mapping, and what we've produced across the country for more than 500 species are these range maps that show, and this shows one species, the white-headed woodpecker, largely in the Sierra Nevada. And we produce these range maps that say, if we see the worst effects of climate change, what areas are still worth protecting? We're working with the Fish and Wildlife Service in 14 of their landscape cooperatives, and this will be published later this fall. So that's who we are. These are our ambassadors. Indeed, we do promote bird watching. We love coming to conservation through birds. Who doesn't love birds? And there's a lot of us. There's 47 million people who told the Fish and Wildlife Service that they like watching birds, that they're active bird enthusiasts. That's second only to gardening. So we're a potent force. What we're about now is figuring out how to mobilize that force for targeted action, because while we work across the flyways, our delivery, our vehicle delivery, is state programs. So I'll let Patrick Comins tell you a little bit about what we're doing here in Connecticut.
Great. Thank you, David. So there's been a lot of talk about flyways and just what is Audubon's Atlantic Flyway project. Well, we've aligned ourselves along the birds. The birds take these flyways and use them as the avian superhighway. And they need 3 things. They need ample breeding habitat, they need high-quality stopover habitat, and they need wintering habitat so they can return to their breeding grounds in shape to produce more birds the next season. So, what is the Atlantic Flyway? Audubon is simply aligning all of our resources towards the conservation of our priority bird species throughout the entire flyway. We have 8 state offices. We have nearly 200 employees through here, and approximately 20 Audubon centers throughout the flyway. So, while we're here in Connecticut trying to protect our salt marsh birds and our beach nesting birds, our friends and colleagues in Vermont are working on the bird factories of the Great Northern Forest, making sure that those can produce the birds that we love to see in migration, the Blackburnian warblers and the Canada warblers that we so love to see. Our partners in Florida are making sure that the stopover areas are there, so when their birds fly across the Gulf, they have high-quality stopover habitat to greet them when they arrive on our shores. And we have over 20 BirdLife International partners throughout the Americas that we're working to empower to conserve wintering habitats for our key bird species. And one thing I forgot, the chapters. Our chapters really are Audubon. They're our grassroots. They're our ultimate boss. They're our members. And we're working to empower those chapters and really awaken that sleeping giant that the birding community can be in a voice for conservation of nature. So what are we doing here in Connecticut along these flyways? We have aligned our work in the same categories that our flyway projects have been organized. One of our high priorities is beach stewardship. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done in partnership with your great staff at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to restore habitat and conserve beach nesting birds here in Connecticut. And the story happens down at Stratford's Long Beach West. And up till the winter of 2010-2011, there were 40 abandoned cottages on Connecticut's longest barrier beach habitat. It was not a good place for people. It was not a safe place for people to go. It was not a good place for birds. There were cats living in those cottages, rats, all sorts of hazards for them. Well, we worked at all levels, from going to every town meeting about the subject, to working with your agency, to working with federal agencies, to working hand in glove with our delegation at the state to ensure that there was funding to remove those cottages through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. We worked with our partners at the Trust for Public Land, the Connecticut Audubon Society, and others. And over the winter of 2010 and 11, all of those cottages were removed. It is now a pristine barrier beach. That was just in the nick of time, because right after that, Tropical Storm Irene came through. And Irene would have knocked down some of the cottages and sent their PCB paint, their lead paint, and their mercury throughout the nearby Great Meadows Marsh. Then again this year, Superstorm Sandy came through and would have knocked down the rest of them. So it was really just in the nick of time and a tremendous conservation victory. It is a better place now for birds and for people. But the story doesn't end there. We want to make sure that people can go and enjoy this beach and that they can share the shore with birds. So again, we're working hand in glove with your staff at the Wildlife Division in partnership with the Connecticut Audubon Society through the Audubon Alliance for Coastal Water Birds. We're organizing, mobilizing, recruiting, and training volunteers to get out there and work as an extension of your staff to get the job done for these birds. Forests. Really important habitat here in Connecticut. I saw a bunch of folks from the Forestry Division coming in as I was arriving. What are we doing for forests? Most people think of forests as the safest habitat in Connecticut, as a primarily forested state. But there's actually been big declines in forest interior habitat here in the state. Just in the 17-year period between 1985 and 2002, we lost nearly 250 square miles of forest interior habitat. So we're working at the flyway level to identify all of the most important areas for forest birds at each bird conservation region. We got those maps from our National Science Division, and then we applied our local knowledge to those maps, refining them, and now we're reaching out to our partners and saying, all right, these are our focal areas. Do you have any tweaks with them? And we'd like them to be the common currency for forest bird conservation. We want these not just to be Audubon's focus areas, we want these to be everybody's focus areas. So please give us your input. We're also working with private landowners, particularly up in the northwest corner of the state, which is very important for forest birds here in Connecticut. Scott Heth and his crew at Audubon Sharon have reached hundreds of private landowners representing thousands of acres, putting them in touch with foresters who really know how to manage forests for birds, empowering them to make good decisions on their private lands. vast majority of Connecticut's forest lands is in private hands, and it's going to remain in private hands for the most part. So not only are we trying to target conservation resources to protect the most important areas where it's going to make the greatest good, we're trying to empower landowners and let them know why their habitat is so important for birds. Tidal marshes. Another really key important habitat here. Most people think of conservation issues, they think of the African savannas, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We have globally important habitats right here in Connecticut. We have 2 official globally important bird areas, Barn Island Wildlife Management Area in Stonington, Hammonasset Beach State Park in Madison. The reason that is because Connecticut has up to 25% of the world's population of the threatened salt marsh sparrow. So what we've been doing is working, again, in partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, to protect key buffers for these important bird areas and potential migration corridors as sea levels rise. This started back in 2004 when I worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Coastal Program and Dave Kozak at the Connecticut DEP to protect nearly 150 acres in the headwaters of Barn Island Wildlife Management Area. Since then, we've helped the state add another 100 or so acres to this really critical area, making it much more resilient to the effects of climate change. That original 150 acres was slated to be a golf course with all its herbicides and fertilizers that would have had a detrimental effect on the marsh. We repeated that formula in several places. We protected over a square miles in the tidal headwaters of the East River Marsh in Guilford, and also key buffers in the Guilford Sluice, again, working in partnership. We also, oh, by the way, the Griswold Airport, a key buffer for the Hammonasset Beach State Park. That parcel, the latest parcel down at Barn Island in Stonington, also happens to be a nesting area for bobolinks. And grassland birds are also a high priority of Connecticut, of Audubon here in Connecticut. We have a long history of working with your wildlife division, Jenny Dixon and others, in the conservation of grassland birds here in Connecticut. We wrote a report protecting Connecticut's grassland heritage back in 2003. The results of that report were used to justify creating some mitigation habitat for the development of Rentschler Field at Cabela's and purchased a new wildlife management area of over 450 acres in Suffield, Connecticut, which is great habitat for the birds that were displaced by that development. Another key part of the landscape in Connecticut are urban and suburban habitats. That's why we have a very robust bird-friendly communities program, where we work with landowners, including municipalities, to improve conditions on the ground in urban and suburban areas. And one of the first projects I worked on here at Audubon when I came here was at Cove Island Park in Stamford, and it was such a tremendous success story. We recognized the area as an important bird area, one of our inaugural important bird areas. We had a few conversations with the mayor of Stamford, who I think might work for the state now, Governor Daniel Malloy. He was amazing to work with down there. He got it after our conversations. He took the initiative. He went to the state. He got the funding to turn this into a permanently protected bird sanctuary. We then worked within the community to develop a partnership among neighbors that became the Cove Island Wildlife Sanctuary Group. Cove Island Wildlife Sanctuary is now one of the top birding spots in Connecticut. It's hosted things like painted buntings, fork-tailed flycatchers, which visited from South America, and a whole host of birds. Every birder in Connecticut knows where Cove Island Park Sanctuary is in Connecticut. It has one of the world-class bird sanctuary that used to be a stump dump. It looks even better than this today, but this was the best picture I could find of it restored. We're also using the power of our centers and our chapters to empower individuals to make everyday changes in their lives that can benefit the birds, to improve their habitats in their yards and in their communities through our Audubon at Home program. And we're producing materials. You actually saw some of those brochures about bird-friendly plants on your chairs when you came in today, that teach people the right decisions they can make to make their yards little important bird areas. And with Long Island Sound, we recognize at Audubon that the health of Long Island Sound is dependent on more than just the shoreline. There is an entire watershed, a five-state watershed that drains into Long Island Sound. So we're working throughout that watershed, particularly in the Connecticut River watershed, to improve habitat conditions throughout the watershed that will benefit water quality in Long Island Sound, and also working directly on the sound front to improve conditions for birds and water quality on the Sound. We've worked together with our partners at Audubon New York to get billions of dollars for clean water infrastructure, particularly in New York City, to help, and of course with both state agencies, to help improve conditions on Long Island Sound. And we're actually seeing the results. And the great thing about the wingspan of Connecticut, of Audubon, is that while we're doing that here in Connecticut, we have Dr. Steve Kress and his crew up in the Gulf of Maine, improving conditions on the Maine islands for Maine seabirds. Today, you can go down, take one of the ferries across Long Island Sound, and chances are you're going to see a razorbill or some other alcid like that. That was unheard of years ago. The improved water quality on the ground here in Connecticut, our partners in Canada working to conserve key nesting areas, and our Project Puffin in Maine are all making these birds have a comeback here in Connecticut, much to the delight of bird watchers. And now the Connecticut River, I almost forgot, the Connecticut River watershed is the nation's first national blueway. It was the inaugural national blueway, beating out places like the White River, which is in Arkansas, which is now a national blueway. And I think they might be thinking about the Yellowstone River now, but you know, the Connecticut River, that was of course the first. And it is really a spectacular watershed, a 7.2 million acre watershed. And just a few months ago, we had Commissioner Esty out near the mouth of the Connecticut River in Old Lyme to see one of the most amazing avian spectacles anywhere on Earth. Roger Torrey Peterson lived in Lyme, Connecticut. His property is actually now part of the Silvio Conti National Fish and Wildlife Refuge, which Audubon actually heads the 4-state coalition called the Friends of the Conti. He had traveled all over the world and seen amazing wildlife and bird spectacles. One day, he went down to the Connecticut River. Somebody told him about this phenomenon down there. Close to 1 million tree swallows roost on one little island off the shore of Connecticut. He'd been all over the world. He said, I didn't realize that the most amazing avian spectacle on Earth is right here in my hometown, in my backyard in Connecticut, in the lower Connecticut River. So if you ever have a chance to go down, Connecticut Audubon Society has some cruises every year to see these swallows. Really, it is amazing. So with that, I'm going to leave time for questions.
So I'm going to let you guys answer your own questions. So Patrick, David, but for those who have not seen that swallow display, it is unbelievable. Hundreds of thousands of birds, and they all come together and circle into a huge vortex and then drop into the wetlands in a matter of about 30 seconds. So it is truly a stunning sight, and I still haven't got this guy to explain to me how those birds don't crash into each other. They're going very fast in this incredible vortex, but maybe you can tell us today. I still don't get it. Thank you.
Birds are all cerebellum, as I said that evening. They're all reflexes. So.
You told me they were all air traffic control.
Yeah.
So we're happy to take any questions. I do want to add to one thing that Patrick said, and thanks for that great presentation, is that as I've been at Audubon now I'm in my third year, well into my third year, and as I got to know the 22 state programs and the 4 national programs, which are policy, international, science, and education. As I got to know the states, I realized they all had different strengths, and very few of them actually have all of the pieces, and Connecticut does. And in terms of leadership, national leadership, what has happened in Connecticut with the Audubon at Home program, particularly out of the Greenwich Audubon Center, is the best in the U.S. The passion that people have for converting their backyards, putting in native plants so that they're better for birds, they're better for kids, they're better for pets, less pesticides. Michelle Frankel and her team and Karen Dixon at the Greenwich Center, there's no better place in the U.S. for that Audubon at Home program than Connecticut, and we're trying to replicate that elsewhere. I want you to know that. So questions?
Can you hold up for a sec so I can give you the microphone so the remote sites can hear you?
Thank you. I'm Philip Miller, State Representative, and my question is, does the organization have any position on genetically modified organisms, which I think are not only an environmental but a health concern?
Our national position on that is that we've monitored some initial studies. We look at those on a case-by-case basis. We're not ruling them out flatly. We're gonna watch that as it progresses.
It's definitely an issue that our members are very interested in. We've had many talks on that down at our Greenwich Center. The community is very interested in that issue.
We know that global food supply is an issue. It's important. One of the things that distinguishes Audubon from other organizations is that we're not absolutist. We are pretty pragmatic, and we're going to take a look at that field as it develops.
David?
I was just curious about the BP monies. Many of the species that were impacted are on the shore there in the winter, but they nest here along our coast. And can some of that funding, what is the pathway for that in terms of improving the support for those species that were impacted there, but without the breeding grounds, some of which were destroyed by the last storm here, whether some of that will flow by a flyway to Connecticut?
So in the overwhelmingly bipartisan deal that was struck in Congress last year, and I would challenge any of you to use that adjectival phrase, overwhelmingly bipartisan deal, in any other context, or very many other contexts, about Washington last year. That deal was basically brokered by the 5 Gulf Coast states. And so 80% of that money is going to go to those states. It's a very complex formula about how it's going to be spent and who's going to determine how it's going to be spent. Senator Whitehouse tried very hard, and in the initial settlement, there was money allocated for fisheries that would have gone in no small part to the Northeast. That fell away in the final conference with the House. So the shorter answer is, I don't expect a lot of that money come to the Northeast. The fact that we got that deal is a massive victory. Being able, so how many of you have been down off of the Gulf Coast, off of the coast of Louisiana, and seen that oil infrastructure? A handful. It's a little bit like Newark, only the size of Rhode Island, and on the water. You're talking about 15,000 rigs, 5,000 of which are active, and there are tons of flames shooting out of the top of a few thousand of those at every moment. So you're out on the water, and what your mind's eye expects to see, certainly my mind's eye as a native Californian, is a serene kind of seascape. And what you see instead is this huge, fairly brutal industrial landscape out on water. And to know that we're going to be able to rebuild those wetlands in Louisiana, which are the first place that a rufous hummingbird can land after a 500-mile migration across the Gulf of Mexico after flying nonstop, being able to hit landfall and have some place to land is critical. So I'd love to be able to have more of that money up here. Having that landing zone rebuilt and that habitat rebuilt is terrific. By the way, are you aware today that an NBA team is about to rename itself after a bird? Yeah, the Hornets are going to rename themselves the Pelicans.
But we did actually get some money related to the Gulf spill recovery, and that was through a partnership with Manomet, where we got some funding, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to monitor and conserve American oyster catchers along the coast of Connecticut. And we were able to complete the first comprehensive inventory of nesting American oyster catchers. And we recently received some additional funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to continue that work for the next 2 years.
One of the things that Audubon has great expertise in is how to rebuild wetlands. So we own about 35,000 acres in the Rainy National Sanctuary down in Louisiana on the Atchafalaya side, the unbroken side of the Mississippi River. And we're going to be relied upon as a part of that process to help teach landowners how to rebuild wetlands.
I have a question right here. If you were speaking to an inexperienced birder who was looking to get started, where would you recommend maybe the top 5 places in the state to go check out locations are? Can you give us a good starting place?
Sure. The Audubon Center at Bend to the River in Southbury would certainly be one of them. It is one of the most beautiful places in Connecticut as well. Audubon Center in Greenwich in September, or any time of year, but that is particularly spectacular because of the hawks that are migrating overhead, and just a truly amazing, spectacular occurrence. Lighthouse Point Park in New Haven is also a similar spot. Milford Point Coastal Center, which is Connecticut Audubon Society facility in Milford. Spectacular place year-round. It's a great place to see tens of thousands of shorebirds in migration. You could see a snowy owl. There could be a snowy owl sitting on that sandbar right now as we speak. Great place to see migrant land birds as well. Hammonasset Beach State Park in Madison, one of the most visited birding locations in the state, a globally important bird area, and just a great place to go birding and enjoy nature. This part of the state, right now, I'm hoping to, on the way home, stop by Rocky Hill Great Meadows, which is along the shores of the Connecticut River there. The other day, there were 2 rough-legged hawks hanging out there, an immature peregrine falcon, an adult bald eagle, about half a dozen red-tailed hawks, and 2 northern harriers. So they're keeping an eye on the place while the buff-breasted sandpipers are down in Argentina.
That's what a diehard birder looks like. On the way home, this is what he's looking forward to going to see. I'd go with you, but we're going different directions. There's a question up here.
Speak loudly. Invasive plants are becoming a bigger issue in Connecticut, and I'm just wondering whether Audubon is keeping an eye on that and whether there's an impact on some of these flyways. I know Connecticut has a problem. I don't know how other states fare with this. Just curious if it's on your radar screen.
Absolutely. We've been involved in the Connecticut Invasive Plants Working Group since its inception back in the 1990s. We've been active on legislation with regard to invasive species up at the Capitol with Sandy Breslin's tireless efforts up here in Hartford. And through the Conti Refuge, as I had mentioned, Audubon chairs the Friends of Conti Coalition. And right now we have a group called the SISMAs, establishing cooperative invasive species management areas and throughout the entire 7.2 million acre watershed. It's not entirely an Audubon project, but yeah, and of course at our centers and sanctuaries we operate those areas as demonstration areas on best management practices, and we eliminate our invasive species where appropriate, but also taking into account what function they're providing now, making sure that we replace that function as those invasives are lost. Of course at the chapter level, the Connecticut Audubon Society has been doing great work with the Friends of Hammonasset at removing invasives down there and replacing them with native trees and shrubs. So yes, invasive species are definitely on our radar screen.
That is, I think without question, that is the common denominator among Audubon chapters across the country. I've been out at the Trinity River Center in Dallas, the Rio Salado Center in Phoenix, with the LA Audubon Center in the LA River. And virtually everywhere I go, that is the activity that they most engage in. Question back there.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Patrick. Jim Part of the State Forest Management Program. This is a compliment. The Naugatuck State Forest is an important bird area, and I know over the years we've had a good working relationship. There's the Naugatuck Valley Audubon chapter has compiled a bird list for the forest, and they posted that on the forestry web page. They post notices about timber harvest on their Facebook page, and they've installed, it's kind of an odd relationship, but as a result of Naugatuck being a IBA, they've installed fishing line receptacle collectors in the fishing ponds and streams along in the forest to collect excess fishing line. And we need a few more IBAs because I'm tired of coming home and pulling wads of fishing line out of my pockets in Natchog Forest along the Natchog River or Nathan Hale, that sort of place. So you'll probably have an email asking you about 4 or 5 other forests. I know we've done blue wing warbler studies over in the Patchogue Forest, and so there's quite a bit of interior activity too. And if someone doesn't, if you live near a state forest, there's places in Coventry to see bobolink in the summer and that sort of thing. So we'll be in touch.
Great. And we're thrilled. We want more IBAs, especially on forests. My stomping grounds as a child were Mashamasik State Forest and the environs there, all going up to Case Mountain in Manchester. I grew up in Manchester, so state forests have an important place in my heart. And a compliment to the state of Connecticut. Naugatuck State Forest is an IBA because of the great management activities of the Forestry Division working together with the Wildlife Division up there. It is great habitat, great early successional habitat, great habitat for forest birds, and finally also chapters just never cease to amaze me.
So I'm certain that everybody in this room knows exactly what an IBA is, but I'm not going to ask just in case somebody doesn't. Could you offer a very quick explanation of what an IBA is?
Sure. Important bird areas, they are the places that are most important to birds in breeding, migratory stopover, or wintering areas. They're the cream of the crop. They're really in some cases, the super rest stops on the avian superhighways of America. They are the bird factories where they produce the birds that we like to see, and they are the key wintering areas for birds throughout the Americas.
So there's about 2,500 of them in the U.S., and it's a naming convention, as Patrick said. It's a convention based largely on the science of the place, the kind of habitat, the types of birds, and the number of birds. And when you actually connect those, what you have is America's veins, this lattice work of America's biodiversity, and our job is to protect the tipping points. Question in the back.
Yes, we've been trying to limit prudently the use of pesticides in Connecticut, and I'd be interested to know if Audubon has an advocacy program or educational guidance for advocates here in Connecticut.
Yes, we have a very robust advocacy program. Sandy Breslin's been heavily engaged in all of the discussions about pesticide laws here in Connecticut. It is a very high up item on our radar screen for the advocacy agenda for the coming legislative session. And also, we have another tack too besides the legislative, and that is through public outreach and teaching people that you don't need to use pesticides, and they're actually a bad thing for people and for birds. Yes.
Sandy, you
Please.
can sign the check now.
Tom?
Question back here.
Oh.
Yeah, not only do the birds migrate, but because of global climate change, habitats are migrating. And I'm just kind of curious as to what you're doing if you're looking at future habitat protection in areas.
So that slide that I showed you about the climate modeling that we're doing, that's actually proprietary science that we will go to open source with in the fall. So we've mapped bird ranges for 500 different species. That basically what that does is it tracks habitat. It tracks habitat change. It projects habitat change. And we looked at various climate scenarios. The one I showed you, because I didn't want to go into great depth, is a worst case climate scenario. So that would give you as land planners and policymakers an idea of what are those places where you'll have no regrets protecting in, as best we can tell, the worst case climate scenario. So yeah, we're looking really hard at habitat migration as well as bird migration. Does that answer your question? Yeah, can you hope to show that more? Yeah, so basically what we're doing now is we're finishing the comment period from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Our goal will be to have it, and it's being peer reviewed. We'll publish it in either Nature or Science, our hope, in probably the fall, and that'll become public domain.
And that's also one reason why we've put so much emphasis into working with our partners to protect landward migration corridors for salt marshes at places like Barn Island, at places like the East River Marsh, at the Salt Meadow Unit for of Stuart B. McKinney National Wildlife Refuge, and in other places. And I know there's some key parcels that are available now in Milford that will be serve that function for the Wheeler Marsh Wildlife Management Area, and that's something that we're hoping to partner again and make sure that happens.
So I just want to add one point to that. I'm really happy to talk about Audubon's successes and what our staff is capable of doing. We don't do any of this alone. All of it's done through partners. All of it's done through agencies like yours and with other nonprofits. Virtually every nonprofit on the environmental landscape, from locals to the big multinationals. And we're proud to be the lead hemispheric partner for BirdLife International, which is a coalition of 115 countries that do bird-focused conservation.
Tom?
Speaking of partnerships, Patrick, your organization and my organization, Connecticut Audubon, are about to start raising money for the Audubon Alliance for Coastal Waterbirds. That's an important project. I was hoping you could sort of tell people what that's about and why it's so important.
Sure. Our organizations have a long history of working together, and we formalized that last year in the Audubon Alliance for Coastal Waterbirds. We're putting to bear all of the resources of our two organizations on the conservation of our high-quality habitats and our important priority species along the coast of Connecticut, our plovers, our terns, our nesting herons, and egrets. Scott Krubosh at Connecticut Audubon Society has acted as the volunteer coordinator. We had over 800 hours of volunteers last season alone, plus 6 field interns out there working hand in glove with DEP Wildlife Division staff and seasonal employees. It's really important to us, and we need to continue that. We want to expand it. Right now, in light of the aftermath of Sandy, that work is more important than it ever was. The habitats of Connecticut's coastline were severely impacted, as were the people of the coast of Connecticut. Many areas where the birds used to nest are washed away. But the good news is that new habitats are created, and these birds really are adapted to seeking out and taking advantage of these ephemeral habitats that arise after storms. The problem is that we need to share the shore with them. And if we just leave them alone to go find these new habitats and nest, they're going to nest right in the middle of pathways. They're going to nest in areas that people are not used to dealing with them, in areas where municipalities are not used to dealing with them, in areas we may not predict where they may show up. We need to get out there early in the spring, together with our staff and volunteers, know where these birds are going to set up, work with those communities and the people in those communities to conserve those birds, and of course continue to work on our strong partnerships with the federal and state agencies who are charged with conserving these birds.
So we're up against the end of our time.
So we'll take a last quick question, and then we'll bring this to a close.
Okay.
Okay, very quickly, this is kind of a follow-up on the global climate change. With sea level rise, do you have any similar plans to map out where marshes might go or how to preserve land that might be needed for that?
Yeah, so we're working on that right now. Just as we're mapping eastern forests, excuse me, using enterprise-wide GIS, we're doing the same with marshlands, with wetlands. Last Thursday night, we had a big event in D.C., in New York, and I had the opportunity to spend a few minutes with Mayor Bloomberg off to the side, and I said, wouldn't it be great to change the conversation right now so that America's coastlines have a soft landing rather than trying to build concrete barriers around them? Let's not go Dutch on this one. And he was very receptive to that, really understood it, and so, yeah, we're going to, as this conversation heats up, we will step up the profile on that too. So I want to thank you all. I know that here in Connecticut, you could choose to do a lot of things for a living. You choose to come here to DEEP to help make Connecticut and the planet a better place every day. Thank you for your service. Thank you for doing that.
Applause for you.
So David, thank you for visiting. Patrick, thank you for your presence here every day. Francis, thank you for joining us today and for your service to the state as well in your interim role. It really is a pleasure to have this conversation ongoing, and what a tremendous partnership it is. We really do recognize that in this era of limited government resources, tight budgets. The only way we're going to succeed is to leverage each other's commitments, our investments, and I think we have been doing that in a very successful way. I look forward to continuing it, and the closing question raised one of the big issues we're going to have to look at together, which is the pressure on the coastline, and particularly some interest on the part of some to harden that coastline. So David, your salient comment and your raising the issue with Mayor Bloomberg is an issue and a conversation we'll be having here. So we'll welcome your participation in helping to educate on the value of a more diverse approach to shoreline protection and to recognize the limits of hardening and the impacts that has adjacent. So thank you all again very much. It really is a pleasure, and look forward to continuing the partnership. Thanks.
Thank you.